we have a really big shoe for you today.
Oh my God.
Giving my lecture on the Septuagint, I figured that I would put on my Ivy League Tweety garb. And we have a very special musical introduction from Adria. Adria, if you will just tell us the title of what you're going to be singing today, going to be playing today.
Yes, Harold, I will. It's from Handel's Alexander's Feast, and it's an aria that is titled Sing Softly in Lydian Mode. And Harold and I communicated in the wee hours of the morning. I told him what my original plan was to for the play in and play out, and he said, "Oh, I'm lecturing on the Septuagint. Can you rustle up something a little Greek for me?" And I thought, how about a salad? And so I was out of olives, so I went to this instead. And because I was so incredible, as I am every single day, incredibly touched by everybody's contribution when they read, I kept thinking about Darina's reading as we ended yesterday's class, and she ended with a Ma Tovu theme. So you'll excuse me if I mash up a little bit of Handel with Debbie Friedman.
Beautiful. Wow, so beautiful, Adria.
So to paraphrase Jeremy, where he said, "Maestro, my song requires violins," I said to Adria, "Maestra, my talk requires viola." So that's what we got started with. So should I jump right in, Rabbi?
You should jump right in.
All right, this will be a Rabbi Moskowitz type talk. I will talk very quickly and I will not stop for questions, and I will leave you scratching your head. But afterwards you can text me and we can discuss it. So the Septuagint, hold on, full screen. All right, here we are. The Septuagint. The Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Koine Greek, which was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean in the Hellenistic age. Started with Alexander the Great's conquest of most of the known world. It is a simpler form of the language of Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, and Euripides. It is not quite as high and poetic. It is really a very workmanlike translation with some poetic language. The Torah apparently was translated first in the 3rd century BCE. That's 3 centuries before the temple still stood in Jerusalem, followed by the other texts over a period of more than 100 years. It appears that the assimilated Greeks of Alexandria didn't fully understand the Hebrew even then. There is a story of 72 translators, an equal number from each of the 12 tribes, thus the reference to it as the Roman numerals XLXX, which is 70. I don't know what happened to, Moshe and Shmuley, the two who they got dropped off. The Septuagint gives us names of 4 of the 5 books of the Torah, and the term Bible, which is the Greek word biblia, or books in the plural. So in Hebrew, Bereshit, in the beginning, becomes Genesis in the Septuagint, which means coming into being in the English Genesis. Shemot, names, becomes Exodos, the road out, or Exodus. Vayikra, and God called, is Leviticus in the Greek, concerning the Levites, or Leviticus. This is the one where we didn't pick up the Greek, but Midbar in the wilderness is arithmoi in the Septuagint, or numbers, which we just use the English translation numbers. Devrim, words, becomes Deuteronomos, the law repeated, or Deuteronomy. The Septuagint contains all of the texts of the Masoretic tradition and some that were not included in the Hebrew Bible canon. As the rabbi has said over and over, there was a lot of text, all of which did not make it into the Bible proper. Most Septuagint texts are very close to the Hebrew text. Esther, however, is quite different. It's almost a different book. The names are different. When I go to read it during Purim, the verses are different. It's a very interesting comparison. Judith appears only in the Greek, not in the Hebrew. I would maintain that it is possible that Esther was first written in Greek and then translated into Hebrew, but that's a discussion for another time. There are some differences in the orders in which the books appear and how they're organized, but I will be sharing this around, but these are works that appear in the Septuagint that did not make, some of which did not make it into the canonical Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint was the Bible text of lay people during the time of Jesus, and is the reason the New Testament is written in Greek, not Aramaic, Hebrew, or Latin. If you think of that time, Jesus probably spoke Aramaic on the street. He likely knew Hebrew well enough to read the Torah and talk about it. Greek would have been the language of study and culture, and Latin would have been the language of authority. So when the writers of the New Testament sat down to start writing, they were writing about stories about someone who probably spoke Aramaic, but they did it in Greek. And most of the quotations of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament can be traced to the Septuagint Greek text, not the Hebrew text. The text of the Septuagint is over 1,000 years older than the oldest extant Hebrew Bible manuscripts, the Leningrad and Aleppo codices, which we showed. The oldest Septuagint manuscripts date from the 4th century CE, so they are the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. They're 600 years before the oldest Hebrew text we have. This is the text of Sinaiticus. There are 4 very similar texts. This one, I believe, is in the British Library. And again, you will see it's on parchment, it has the columns, it has all capital letters, and it does not have any punctuation in it. The Septuagint, as the rabbi has told us, may give us hints as to variations in the Hebrew text of the 3rd century BC, because the Septuagint translators were looking at a text 1,200 years older than the oldest text we have. Now, in almost all instances, it looks like the text they were looking at is very similar to the text we have. They were not looking at a dramatically different text, but this is the critical text of the Bible that we've discussed. This is Psalms, and here, wherever you see Greek, that is referring to the Septuagint language to see if there might be some hint as to what the Hebrew means. Here is one of the cruces, Selah. What does Selah mean? What did the Septuagint translators translate it as? They translated it as diapsalma. Now, if we knew what diapsalma knew, we would know what Selah meant. We don't. When you go into the text and you look back and forth, when you go to diapsalma, it says Greek translation of Selah. But it doesn't say, it's not clearly something else. It doesn't say, please rise. It doesn't say, turn the page. It doesn't say, go for a little bathroom break here. It seems to have the word psalm in it, is salma, and dia, which means through or opposite. So it has some relationship to something either aside for the psalm or a a superscription that's not really part of the text. There are several instances where the translation from Hebrew to Greek to English causes great confusion and misunderstanding. One of them is the Moshiach to Christos to anointed. Here is the Greek dictionary where Christos, the basic meaning is to be rubbed on, used as an ointment or salve, which then becomes anointed, being having anointing oil put on you, and then Christos, the anointed one, is the Christ, or a translation of the Hebrew, Messiah, Moshiach. So I found an example here of the Living Bible, which is one of those cool contemporary translations of the Bible that Christians use. This is Psalm 2, verse 2. For a summit conference of the nations has been called to plot against the Lord and his Messiah, Christ the King, which is not in the Hebrew, but if you have the Hebrew Messiah translated Christos, it is just too tempting for the Christians not to say that Christ is mentioned in the Psalms. Another one is the Alma Parthena virgin. So in Isaiah, where an ex will bear a child who will become the Messiah, in Hebrew it is Alma, which is a young woman, which can have the connotation of someone who has not had sexual relations yet, but doesn't really mean virgin. The Greeks translated it as to Parthena, which probably has a stronger connotation of virgin, and the Christians then translated into virgin. It would be a big, so there is a lot of controversy about this. Should that verse, when used in Christian contexts, say, and a young woman should bear a child? And it really calls into question the whole concept of the virgin birth. The last one I'll mention here is whether or not the Last Supper was a Passover Seder. The word used for what Jesus broke is artos, which is bread. There is a Greek word for matzah, which happens to be matzah. And if it was supposed to be the Last Supper and he was breaking matzah, the Greeks had a perfectly good word. They would have used matzah. They did not. They said that he broke bread. The word psalm comes from the Septuagint name of this book, which is psalmoi, or music accompanied on a musical instrument. This is Psalm 1, laid out in the Septuagint. The text of all 150 psalms appear in the Septuagint, but due to assignment of different verses to different psalms, there's some difference in numbering. And there is a Psalm 151 in the Greek that does not appear in the Hebrew. So you can see, basically, when it comes to the Psalms, there is not a big difference in the Septuagint text from the Masoretic text. Although, as we looked at, what did we say, Psalm 1 and 2 might feel like they might be together. Psalms 9 and 10 actually make an acrostic when you start at the beginning of Psalm 9 and go to the bottom of Psalm 10, as we will see. And so in the Greek, they make that Psalm 9 and put it together. As I said, the Septuagint translator or translators seemed as puzzled by Sela as we are, translating as Dia Salma. The superscriptions are quite different. In Psalm 4, where the Hebrew is, according to Alter, for the lead player with stringed instruments, a David psalm, the Septuagint has, for the end, ace telos, which nobody seems to understand exactly what that means, but telos is the word for end. For the end, a song of David among the psalms. For Psalm 19, the Septuagint translates the Hebrew michtam, which Alter leaves as michtam because there's no evidence of what exactly it means. The Greek translators felt that that meant some sort of inscription. The Septuagint continues to be the Bible of the Greek-speaking church. It fell out of use in Jewish settings after the rise of Christianity to be replaced by the Aramaic Targum as a translation into the vernacular for Jews who did not understand the Hebrew, likely because the Septuagint became, as Christianity diverged from Judaism, the Septuagint became the Bible, the Old Testament of the Christians, and the Jews started realizing that there were a lot of very small places where it varied that they didn't like. The first printed version of the Septuagint is not a text just of the Septuagint. It appears in the Complutense Polyglot Bible from 1513, printed in Alcala, Spain, which is one of the masterpieces of printing in the world when you consider that printing was only 60 years old or so at this point, and every single piece of every single type needed to be cut separately. You have the here's Psalm 1, Ashrei Ha'ish. You have the Hebrew, and then you have the Latin, and then here you have the Greek running from left to right, and then above the Greek, for people who wouldn't understand it, there is Latin word by word. It's an interlinear translation. I will say that I held this in my hand. They have a copy at the JTS Rear Book Room. I cried. It is one of the most beautiful things, one of the most meaningful things I ever saw, one of the most magnificent pieces of physical culture I think that exists. There are only about 65 copies left in the world. Yeah. They have one in the JTS Rare Book Collection, and I do hope that once things open up, we will be making a trip and get the VIP guided tour, and you will be able to turn to this page of this very book and hold it in your own hands. So that is the end of my little walk through the Septuagint. These are just a few of the sources that I used as I put this lecture together. And I will end, and Rabbi, you can let me know if you want to take a few questions.
Yeah, let's take a few questions. Thank you, Harold. Fantastic. And you can see why when you start to really study the Bible, like I did as a rabbinical student in a way that's a combination of academic and spiritual, you have to learn to read Greek. And we were required before rabbinical school, in the summer before rabbinical school, to learn to decode the Greek alphabet so that at least we could read the matter in the scientific edition of the Bible. Because without Greek, if you're doing serious study of the Bible, you really can't go as deep as what we have in our hands. So Greek is, any scholar of the Bible will know Greek. And then Latin becomes important for the Vulgate, which we'll talk about. Maybe Harold will give a talk about the Vulgate.
There's another lecture on the Vulgate that I'm working on.
Okay, and we'll do another lecture on the Vulgate. But I hope you're excited about your ability to understand the significance of what Harold's talking about. And Harold, I hope you're excited to see the book with Psalm 1 and now have a different relationship with Psalm 1
totally.
you ever had. And I think this is, now you're at a place, imagine we've now been studying 8 or 9 weeks, you're now at a place to begin to understand. Imagine had you heard Harold's lecture before you began this journey. So let's definitely have a few questions or comments, and then we'll go right into some.
So Gail had her hand up.
So what we know today is the Hebrew Bible, the one we use. The latest copy, the oldest copy is from like 1,000 years ago. But so how do we know to make all these statements about what the Septuagint did or didn't use? So I'm confused there, the basic premise.
That's a great question, Gail. If the translation was made in 300 BC, it was made from a text of the Hebrew Bible that they had that we don't have. So the question is, were they looking at basically the same thing that we have? So the question has always been, is the text that we have, which is over 1,000 years older than the composition, has it been corrupted? Has it changed much over the years? Or are we looking at a text that's basically similar to the original text? And it gets answered several ways. One is when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls from the same time as the Septuagint, you see a text that is substantially similar to what we have with some interesting small differences.
Definitely differences, but it's largely, it's surprisingly similar.
And so the translators of the Septuagint 1,200 years ago, do we feel that the text they were looking at is similar to the one we have, or were they looking at a substantially different text? And since the Septuagint text is quite similar to the text of the Hebrew Bible we have, you can say in a large scale, they were looking to a text that was similar to what we have, although they felt that there was more of that text that was biblical. But in many small instances, it appears that they had a word or two that were different in their texts, or they had a different understanding of what the word means than what we might, because if Hebrew was spoken somewhere or they were in the land of Israel, they could say to someone, what do you think this word means? They say, oh, I know what that word means, because as the rabbi says, you know, until you've heard someone speaking the language, although it doesn't seem like they went up on the Temple Mount to try to figure out, okay, when you sing these Psalms, what does Selah mean? I wish they had done that and said, you know, we went up there and we asked the high priest.
Probably because it was so obvious in the time. That's one of the interesting things when you deal with ancient texts. Sometimes words are so obvious to even translators of that same moment, it doesn't occur to them that it needs to be explained. And then that's where we realize the thousands of years of gap put us at a loss. Sometimes there are words that are just so obvious, you know, and that they wouldn't think that they needed to be explained. Right. And that's why we don't have them. And there's a concept that Harold referred to, is when we understand there is a text that everybody was working from that we no longer have. Scholars then try to talk about the Ur text, the text that was the source for everything. We might not have that original text, but scholars then try and figure out, what is the Ur text? What is the text from which the texts we have come from? And believe me, the closer you get to PhD land, the more these small differences that Harold and I are talking about become massive, because you have to justify a PhD. But when we talk about small differences in the world of academia, I mean, they go on and on and on about these very, very small differences. But everybody will argue that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and studied, which took decades, one of the significant findings is that the differences are much smaller than we had imagined them to be. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are critical to answering that leap from the Septuagint to the Leningrad or the Aleppo codices.
So there are some questions about the Targum, which may be a different lecture, but the Targum is a translation of the Hebrew into Aramaic, correct?
Yes.
And like the Targum Anklos. And so there's you can look at, what does the Targum say? What does the Dead Sea Scrolls say? They're all in that critical apparatus. What does the Septuagint say, to try to figure out what did the Ur text say?
So Targum literally means translation. And because Aramaic was the vernacular language, when the word Targum was used in that moment, it meant what was the translation of Hebrew to the vernacular, the language that everyone was speaking. We have a couple of important examples of the Targum. One is the Onkelos, or Harold will pronounce. How do you pronounce it, Harold?
Onkelos. I say Onkelos.
Is that the Greek pronunciation?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so the Jewy pronunciation, the Yiddish, the Hebrew, the Yeshivish is Onkelos, and the Targum Onkelos is important for all Bible studies, and it appears, remember I showed you what a Masoretic Bible looks like my Mikrot Gedolot? The Targum Onkelos appears alongside of the Hebrew for the entire Bible. It is considered essential because, again, that Aramaic was being spoken to understanding the Hebrew. So Rashi will be on one side and Targum Onkelos, I can go and get it, is on the other side. There are other Aramaic translations that have been discovered that are not as standard or as widespread. One very famous one is called Targum Neophiti. And so scholars, compare because anything that's in Aramaic is going to be very important to us, because that was, and for Christians, by the way, anything in Aramaic is very important because that was the language of Jesus. So the only manuscript that exists in the world of this very important Targum called Targum Neophiti is in the basement of the Vatican. You've heard me talk about my belief in the Vatican. And the Vatican probably has a lot of interesting manuscripts because for Christianity, it's very important, but very few people have access.
And quickly about the Targum, it seems as if the reading technique for back in ancient times was someone would read the Hebrew, and then there was someone standing beside him who would give a spontaneous translation into Aramaic.
Yes.
And it was not allowed to be written down because they were afraid that if they wrote down the Aramaic, there would be another canonical text and people would study the Aramaic. So you were supposed to do it spontaneously, as we do from time to time, and they wanted different people to do it differently so that there wasn't one authoritative Targum, but eventually they said, you really have to write this down, and we got an authoritative Targum text.
And by the way, the tradition, and I don't know, Shari and Debbie, if you had this in your life as Frum Jews, but the tradition for studying the Parsha every week is that you're supposed to read it once in Hebrew and twice in Targum, but that's become translated, at least in my Frum world, to be twice in whatever your vernacular is. But a really Frum Jew will do it each week. Shari and Debbie, did you have anything like that in your world? What did you do? No?
So
Hold on, I want to hear what Shari and Debbie say about that practice.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi. No, just to read, we just had the Parsha, so it must have been a less from, different from.
I don't know, I think different from cultures. I'm going to ask Moskowitz about that. But so there's this phrase that says once in Targum, once in, but well, anyway, so that's the Targum, very important. Maybe we'll do another lecture on that, Harold.
there's one more thing that I didn't put in my talk, which is that the word Torah, which can mean Torah or law, gets translated into the Septuagint as nomos, which is the simple Greek word for law. But it then gets translated into English as law. When you're reading the New Testament, whenever you read the word law, try replacing it with Torah, because it is likely that when they refer to the law, they're actually referring to the Torah. And it makes the New Testament makes a lot more sense if you try to replace every instance of law with Torah and see if it works.
But then you understand the Christian focus on replacing the law, meaning the halakha, the laws of the Torah, with love of the New Testament. But that's a whole other topic.
So that's another topic. I'll proofread this and I'll send it around to everybody.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Harold.
Wikipedia has so many different rabbit holes you can go through.
Yes,
So,
and I hope you all can really appreciate how much fun it is to begin to understand the impact that all of these levels of understanding will have on our reading a text like the Psalms. All right, so let's jump into Psalm 6.
How about a little Psalm 6?
How about a little Psalm 6?
Little Psalm 6, which is a fabulous psalm.
Fabulous. Now remember in that sheet that I sent around, and I've talked about it when we started Psalm 1, one can loosely talk about the different categories that each psalm fits in. And of course, categories are never precise as any definition, and some psalms can fit into multiple categories. So don't be too worried about figuring out only one category. But one category of psalms is an example that we found in Psalm 1 of a wisdom psalm, a psalm that's teaching us how to live a good life. You know, it's about wisdom. It's about what makes a good life. We remember from Psalm 1. Other psalms are known as lamentation or supplication psalms, psalms that are full of asking God for help and lamenting our condition. So we've seen a few different examples of this, and Psalm 6 is another example of it in an even more intense form. So let's read it through first, just in the Hebrew, and I'll talk about some of the words and some of the problematic words as we try and figure out how to translate it, how to understand it. So Lamanatseach, again, we've now encountered this. This Sepharia translation translates it as leader. We know we're not totally sure what it means. So let's just, it'll always be interesting how the translator looks at the word Lamanatseach. So it's always a question. So this one does leader. We've seen, oh, there goes Penny barking. Can you all hear Penny? Sorry. Let me make sure the door is closed. Randy, can you get Penny? Of course, Randy's also on something. So, by the way, I'm wearing my Cornell. Is Steve Frew on the class today? I'm wearing Randy's Cornell t-shirt today. I know Steve Frew is a Cornell. Okay, so Lamanatseach, we don't actually really know. You'll see a lot of differences. We've seen somebody, sometimes it's what does leader mean? Sometimes it's been seen as the lead instrumentalist or conductor, or I think one of us translated it as maestro, so that was a beautiful, beautiful understanding of it. I never thought of that. But there's a lot of question. Nobody really knows. Vanginot, again, we had that word before, and we saw sometimes it's left untranslated. Many people think it means some kind of string instruments. Now it's interesting here, this translator is saying, okay, it's instrumental, but we don't know what kind of instrument. We'll see sometimes it's translated as string, largely because of this, al hashminit. Now this translation doesn't even try and translate shminit. So our Hebrew speakers on the phone, what do you see, or Hebrew understanders, what do you see in the word shminit? What is the root there? And Yael says eighth. So it means eighth. It's the number shmini, like shmona esrei. So shmi, it's from the Hebrew word for eight, the number eight, not eight as in eat, but the number eight. So some people think, well, what is the eighth what? And they believe it's eighth string, like a lyre or other string instruments. And that's why some people think bin ginot al hashminit means stringed instruments, and in this case, an eight-stringed instrument. So there you go. But you see, nobody, when you read it, and if you were to read a translation, and we will look at some which say the eight-stringed instrument, those are a lot of assumptions in translating it that way. I'm explaining now why the translator is making those assumptions, but it doesn't mean we for sure know. But it's certainly a legitimate way to look at it. By this translator leaving it wide open, we don't know. Could it mean eighth something else? I don't know. Are lyres typically eight strings? Because that's what a lot of people will translate this as lyre. I actually don't know. And then Mizmor LeDavid. We're back at this Psalm of David, or David's Psalm. And remember, and thank you, Harold, for your emphasis on this, that psalm means song, some kind of musical setting. It doesn't mean poem. It doesn't mean just something written. It absolutely means something about music. And in the Hebrew, that's clear. For us as English speakers, the word psalm doesn't only mean that. So that's a really important memory. And I loved that somebody in one of the your psalms, which I cannot remember now, talked about how David has in the word David the word for beloved. And that's correct. That's a kind of a loose reading of it, but a lovely reading, because Dodi, my beloved, for instance, Ani LeDodi v'Dodi li, it's the same shoresh. Okay, I'm going to stop at the end of verse 1 and see if there are questions or comments. And I'm just going to open up this for a second.
Hold on, let me see if I can get my...
Let's just, because this is a psalm of, I think there are, 11 verses.
All right, let's see who has her hand up. Well, Shep had a hand up from before. Shep, did you have a question about the psalm?
Yeah, let's stick to the psalm right now. So let's...
No, it was about the Septuagint.
Okay, then Lisa.
Let's stick to the psalm right now.
Hi. So I just wanted to show everybody this book. This is a wonderful book by a great
Hold it up
ethnomusicologist, if you can see it. Joachim Braun, his name is. And this is a wonderful book for anybody who's interested in the musical instruments of the Bible.
Wow.
He also interprets that word as eighth.
The word definitely means eighth. We just don't know what eighth means. And I wonder if any of the musicians respond to eighth as a meaningful word in anything music related. I don't know.
Just as an octave. Eight notes make one complete scale.
Oh, that's interesting.
Ira?
Which we don't know if they were using those scales, right? Is that...
Well, it could have been tuned modally, but it still would have had eight tones.
Fascinating. That's very interesting.
I was wondering about what kind of modes existed back then, and if it possibly could have referred to the eighth mode or an eighth tone of something.
You know, this is definitely not my field. I have been told that we have no idea what the music sounded like in that time. And it sounds like maybe that book you have on music in the Bible can say something more about that. But that's why I asked Adria, is octave something that's a Western, I just don't know, when did the concept of octaves come?
Well, you would have octaves in modal music as well. The tonalities.
I don't know what modal music means.
Modal, it's not organized in a way that our do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, Julie Andrews running through the Alps kind of scale. They have particular sounds, and the intervals are not spaced
the same way.
in the system that we're used to hearing in what you refer to as Western music. So I bet you Simon has something to say about this.
Well, this would be a very interesting topic for somebody to do some research on because it has a lot to do with what we're doing, but I just don't know much about it. And I'm not sure anybody knows anything definitively, but people have, I'm sure, and it looks like not just the instruments of the Bible, but what we know about what it would have sounded like.
And Lisa,
Are there octaves before we chant?
Let's raise hands because otherwise it's impossible.
number one, Lisa, if you could put that book title in the chat, I will put it on Facebook. I know you're not on Facebook. Sarah Siegel has had her hand up for a while.
Okay, you're not going to answer the question.
You know, I'm realizing if they weren't using Arabic numerals, this is a silly idea, but I like the idea that the number 8 is shaped like a violin.
Very nice.
They used Arabic numerals back then, or do we know, Harold?
No, it would not have been, and there wasn't a
Not
violin.
have been, but yes, they had ways of indicating numerals, of course.
Right.
But not, if it wasn't that shape, then scratch it. Okay, thanks.
Simon, I think Simon wanted to answer.
But for sure there were string instruments, and for sure there were wind instruments.
Yeah, the octave is a very, very fundamental acoustic phenomenon.
Got it.
And it is also when men and women sing together, because of the different timbres of the voice, tend to be octaves. So, and in fact, in the history of Western music, the intervals that are used as they get more complex tend to be based on the acoustics. So an octave is a string vibrating in 2 pieces. A fifth is a string vibrating.
Wow, I'm learning a lot. So I'm sure that's somewhere in this Shmini thing. And whether or not the instrument itself covered an octave or whether and does an instrument cover an octave? Like if it were an 8-stringed instrument, would that be an octave or is that a stupid question?
Usually the 8 strings allow for a larger range of notes to be played because one string could only have a certain range depending on where you place the finger. So they almost certainly had octaves. I mean, it's so fundamental.
Wow, so this is very interesting. I'm really intrigued by this. I think this is.
Even though the strings, if you look at a lyre, a picture of a lyre, even though the strings are sometimes the same length on certain lyres, their pitches will be different according to their thicknesses.
Aha. So you'll notice, and you notice that on in Alter's book, he starts every psalm with a picture of a lyre.
Right.
And I assume there are different kinds of lyres, obviously. And anyway, all right, fantastic. Anything else about this verse?
Benjamin Shaffrin. Benjamin. Okay.
I want to mention that there's a parallel to this in Mizmor Shir Leyom HaShabbat, where it says, Alei Asor.
Exactly. Well, that's going to be, that's one of the Psalms that has actually lists of different musical instruments.
And the Asor would probably be with 10 strings.
Interesting. So I've never thought about that, but that makes sense because that means 10 in Hebrew.
Right.
Wow.
Jim Brule.
Just a note that the octave is often a step into another world, right? It's the same note in another world. Yip Hargberg used that in Over the Rainbow to say, now we're here, now we're in Oz. So it could also have that kind of mystical ascent into another world.
That's fantastic. Love that. Thank you, Jim.
Lisa, did you have one last
octave?
Yeah, so I was just going to add that the octave gets developed after these 4 or 5-tone scales actually are in the ancient world. And if you listen to early chants, Arabic music, the range is much smaller. So the octave is later, and these scales first get discovered by or named by the triangle guy, whose name is escaping me at the minute, the guy who defines the isosceles triangle. Was that his name, isosceles?
Pythagoras.
Pythagoras, yeah. So Pythagoras is the beginner of the scales. He's the one that names the scales, and they're 5-note scales. They're not full octaves yet. And then at some point they become full octaves. So I mean, it's interesting because that really ties into. And there's also a difference between the strings and the Khalil. The Khalil is a very loud instrument. So we read, so these references to the Chalil was very interesting because they're not allowed where somebody is singing. You can't sing over a Chalil, you know, a Chalil is ear splitting. So, I mean, it's interesting, the dichotomy between the stringed instruments, which are accompaniment instruments, and the Chalil, which is going to take over.
Wow, this is fantastic. This is really wonderful for me. Thrilled. Thank you.
You want to
I'm
take
having
verse
music
2?
conservatory flashbacks right now.
Well, this is great.
And I didn't do my homework.
Well, we're staying with the
yeah.
Psalm for a little bit. All right, so let's look at Psalm at verse 2.
Verse 2. Okay,
Begins with Yud Hey Vav Hey. Oh, oops.
Hold on, whoops. Sometimes it seems like I'm not getting it here. All right, you got it?
Got it. Can you make it a tiny bit larger for my?
I can.
And I'm okay. Good. So Psalm 2. And again, the question whether that first line, not Psalm 2, verse 2, that first pasuk is a superscription or part of the psalm. That's an ongoing question with psalms. Do we read this as an integral part of the poem, or is it something that's telling us about just, kind of notes to those who will be singing it or playing it, and that's, again, that I would put in the unresolved issues that people who play or study these psalms struggle with. There isn't an answer. I'll say that also over and over again. So Yud Hey Vav Hey Hashem. So starting a pasuk with Yud Hey Vav Hey is absolutely an emphatic. Hebrew verses naturally in the Bible start with verbs. If a sentence doesn't start with a verb, there's some kind of emphasis there, and it's to a Hebrew hearer, biblical Hebrew speaker. This is like bold print or italics or something, or big print or something like that. It has emphasis. So Yud Hey Vav Hey Hashem. Al, do not, that's a negative. Now this is interesting. It says bi'apcha. So what's an af in Hebrew?
Nose.
Hebrew people? It's a nose. An af is a nose, and it's used in biblical Hebrew to mean anger. And we think the reason it's used to mean anger is because noses flare when people are angry. So I love that idea that it's used, so it doesn't mean don't put your nose at me or something, or don't blow your nose. It means it is the body part that somehow in biblical Hebrew, because noses flare when you're angry, mean anger or some kind of fury, some kind of rage. It's quite a strong word. And tochi. Now this word is from the word to admonish or to admonish or to admonish is good. So Yud Hey Vav Hey, God, the big one, the big name of God, do not in your anger admonish me. So they're using punish me in anger. Okay, that's good. And then we have the etnachta. So the semicolon there, right there after. So the first 4 words there are the first part of the phrase. The second part of the verse, which is the second phrase, vi'al, and don't. But remember, whenever the vav is, here we go with the dog stuff. Vi'al, don't, that's very distracting, isn't it? I'm sorry. Don't, vi'al, don't, bechamt. This word is the same thing it's a repetition of the first half of the word, but of the first half of the verse. Again, do not, I like this translation, do not chastise me in fury. So one can say, don't punish me, don't chastise me, right? But it's adding here anger and fury, or so there's intensity here. There's intensity in the reference to God's name, and there's intensity to feeling like God, like the universe. Take out the word God, for instance, if you don't want to feel like there's an individual, that God is punishing individuals. But how often have you felt like the universe is punishing you, that you are being so this is very strong. How are we doing on time? Do we have time?
We're done.
No, we're done?
So
Okay, so we'll continue with Psalm 6.
we will be played out by Adria. I will just say that on the publishing project, I'll send out a little note that the gates are closing. Friday is the last day to submit either something you haven't sent us or a revision of something you have sent us. If you're sending us a revision, please mark that it's version 2 or version 3 so that we don't wind up trying to figure out which is the best one. We will then be putting them together and going back with queries to make sure we have it. I would also suggest that if you want to, you read your poems out loud, because I noticed as you were reading off your text, a lot of you made very small changes and added words, and you may want to make sure that it sounds right when it's being read. And with that, Adria, Maestra, play us out. You're muted. Hold on. Adria, you're muted.
Of course I'm muted.
Okay.
I sound best when I'm muted. Just a little bit more of the Debbie Friedman here.
Beautiful, everybody. So our next class is Tuesday. No class on Monday because of Memorial Day. And may the memories of all those who have died in wars and in other ways of defending freedom be remembered. And I wish everybody a beautiful Shabbos. And I'll see everybody in class on Tuesday. Keep studying Psalm 6. And for those of you who are musically able to understand these articles, dive deep into this question. It'll be a very interesting addition. And thank you so much to Harold for teaching us so much and bringing us such depth from the classics. And this was a wonderful, wonderful lecture, Harold.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to give it. All right, everybody.
All right, everybody. Bye-bye. The room will stay open for a few minutes.